Welcome everyone again to this fascinating webinar today by the Prevention Collaborative on integrating design thinking into evidence-based practice to prevent intimate partner violence. Our two panelists today, Jackie Namubiru from the Innovation for Poverty Action and Rachel Lehrer from the International Rescue Committee will take us through a couple counseling program named Becoming One that maximized the strength of two methods, design and evidence-based research to reduce IPV among couples in Uganda. So today, we learn on how human-centered designed approach helped the team to ask the right questions to identify problems with more accuracy, iterate on solutions meaningfully, and it's the whole process is agility to fail fast, build and scale the program. For any of us interested in solving wicked problems of the world, this is a model that allows for creativity and innovation while simultaneously allowing for solutions rooted in evidence. I am now going to introduce our panelists. Very excited to introduce Jackie Namubiru. She's a program associate at the Innovations for Poverty Action, where she currently manages on-the-ground implementation of the Becoming One program. Previously, Jackie managed the fieldwork for multiple projects, randomized evaluations, and pilot projects at IPA, focused on gender, entrepreneurship, health, and education. Her projects in the past 3 years has focused mainly on GBV prevention and social norms around gender-based violence. Welcome, Jackie, to the webinar, and thanks for agreeing to present today. Our next panelist is Rachel Lehrer. She's the Associate Director of Design and Innovation at the Airbel Center, the research R&D lab at the International Rescue Committee. The IRC is a humanitarian aid organization working in 40 of the most unstable countries in the world. Prior to joining the IRC, she was designing the experience for Link NYC, a communications network that brings fast Wi-Fi to millions of New Yorkers, a new lobby experience for a prestigious New York City museum, and digital banking with the World Bank for the poorest women in Pakistan. Welcome, Rachel. Before we start, just a request to all the participants that for Jackie and Rachel, we'll have about 45 minutes to take us through the study. We'll take questions after that. We'll take all your questions and they'll be happy to answer them. Over to you, Rachel, now.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be happy to be here today. Really honored to be talking to you all. And sharing the stage, so to speak, with Jackie. As Priya mentioned, today I'll be talking about design thinking and really an integrated process of design and a process that should look very familiar to most of you, one that's very evidence-based and rooted in rigorous research, whereas a lot of design work is able to and uses a lot more sort of flexibility and less rigor. So I'll be talking about the integration of those two processes, specifically during the prevention, to achieve the prevention of IPV in Uganda. Although at the Airbel Center, we use this process across a whole host of different sectors and for different purposes. So to start with, I'll really cover looking into what a normal process looks like for some of us versus a design process, and really what constitutes a design process in this particular instance. So many of you may have seen what looks like a 5-stage process of design, and I'll go a little deeper into sort of what are some catalytic moments in which design and both research can really feed off of each other. And then what this blended approach looks like in practice. And then Jackie will really take us through a case study, this project Becoming One that Priya mentioned, that's a couples counseling program that's been delivered by faith leaders. So that's the general flow, and then we're really excited to take your comments afterwards. Great. So what does our normal program process look like? So the usual process is you start with a needs assessment or some other kind of formative research. You spend a while designing the program. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to pilot it and figure out sort of the big tweaks you need to make. And then you implement and evaluate the program. And then at the end, you learn from your mistakes, hopefully, again, right? What you might learn, though, is that people don't really want to use it. It has little impact, or it's not scalable or sustainable. So in retrospect, there are many things that could have been improved, right? You learn at the end that maybe the way people were targeted and informed didn't work quite right. When and where the program was implemented, it was the wrong choice. Who delivered the program mattered, and yet maybe you didn't make the right choice there either. And then there are tons of other things that surely from the data or from qualitative research you learned could have been improved should you have asked certain questions ahead of time. So the question then becomes, how do we build better programs? If you keep designing programs in the same way and you keep learning at the end that mistakes were made or different choices could have been made, what's a better alternative? So you can use a process that finds failures fast and builds confidence in the final solution. So this is what a design process frequently looks like, right? And it becomes, I don't want to hold design up as this very, this thing that you need a lot of education to use or that you need to be trained in, because if you look at it, it reads as incredibly intuitive, hopefully. So first you spend a while understanding what the problem is. And this takes a particular mindset that I'll talk about later. And then you simultaneously then understand what the opportunities are. So design is an optimistic pursuit, right? You understand the problems, but you also understand things like what people are already doing. And those becomes opportunities for you. And as you're understanding the opportunities, you try out some small ideas that are really quick to try out, and then you probably fail as well, right? So you're already asking those initial questions when you're just trying to put the idea together, right? And understand what your opportunities are. Then you have a new idea and you invest quite a while in actually figuring out what that idea is and building it. And then you, you test it out. So you fail fast. And I say fail fast because this process of testing is one in which you fully expect that you're not going to get it right the first time. So you test different components of it. You don't test the whole thing at once. And then finally, you build and scale the idea, right? And this is when, in sort of that, this one sort of summary block at the end, that's when you're really implementing it, right? And even in the implementation, you're finding new things you can improve on. So what can design do? Well, design really does two things. It looks at the needs of people, and it also looks at the values of people. And at the intersection of those two things is what creates a meaningful, impactful experience for people. And so when you're testing out your idea, what you're looking for is a meaningful, impactful experience. And what you're continually thinking about is how do you solve people's needs, but also how do you build on their values? So what's a design mindset and approach? There are 4 general stages, right? And these are things that are sort of happening continuously. It's not really a linear process. So the first is you want to be open. You need to understand evidence, but you acknowledge that you don't know the answer. Maybe it's for this particular user or client, or you just have to be open to the idea that you will learn things that you might not know already. So openness is hugely important to building something new. And to also learning from people, which takes us to look and think. So you really have to put yourself in your user's shoes, and you have to identify their problems and values. So first is this sort of personal openness, and the second is really giving yourself the opportunity to learn from those around you, right? To understand that maybe someone else has solved this problem for themselves and that you can learn from them. Third, create, build, and test. So this is the process, again, of failing fast. You want to prototype and evaluate a range of ideas, right? Not settling on one, still being open to the idea that something new might come up. And then you iterate and refine with users, right? With users until it's right. And the important thing here, and this is a little bit of a contradiction, is that details matter. So great ideas with small flaws fail. And yet at the same time, you have to be able, as you're building and testing things, you have to be able to do it quickly and in a scrappy way. So I'll just describe what a prototype is, right? A prototype is a manifestation, it's a physical, tangible thing that is a way to test an idea. So it might be a storyboard, or it might be what's called a paper prototype, which is, you know, akin to like origami for something, right? You want to test out how someone might visit a clinic. Well, you set up a little bunch of Lego pieces and you act out the different scenarios. So prototypes come in all shapes and sizes. The point of a prototype, though, is not to represent what the end product will look and feel like, but it's rather to help explain an idea to your users and explore it in a tangible way. And then finally, scale and sustain. So this is really important to be thinking about throughout as well, thinking about who will carry out the program, how it will spread, right? And this is where value becomes important, because it is something that people need to care about in order to spread it. And you strive for it to have a life of its own. So here's some examples of all these things. So for example, be open. You focus on your users' needs and values rather than what you wish they were. Some principles for that is it's about them, not you. You want to take inspiration from anywhere, and failing is your fault, right? Trainings are not always the answer. If someone doesn't understand something, it's likely because you've made it too complicated, not that they need to be trained more to understand it. So it's a different mind. It's a little bit of a shift from how we normally think. One of those things, if you remember the diagram of sort of failing early on, is this concept of a sacrificial concept. So for example, in the breathe and relax diagram you see here, right, mindfulness and breathing is a tool for emotional regulation. This was something we knew based on evidence going into our field work. We tried to illustrate it, right? We tried to make it something that was easy to understand. And what we realized is this card is completely insufficient to get people to understand how to breathe in and breathe out. Someone saw this and said, holding your breath, that's not good for you. So it's incredibly important very, very early on to put things in front of people, even things that have tons of evidence behind them, because the details of how you communicate matter. Look and think. So you want to use evidence, similar experiences, analogous experiences, and lots of interviews and observations of your users. So you want to test your understanding, observe how and who in your context is already solving the problem and learn from them. And then you want to understand habits. So meaningful and necessary things become habits. And so you want to build on top of people's existing habits, because those are keys to actually incorporating things that are going to be lasting. Create, build, and test. This again is learning from the tools that people have around them. So for example, the top left-hand corner is a way that a faith leader took our sort of cognitive behavioral therapy tools and incorporated them into his sermon. These are his sermon notes. The other things you see here are different prototypes that we tested with people, that all but the bottom right corner all failed. But it was really important for us to put them in front of people. So again, don't just talk. Build confidence in your idea by testing things little by little. And you don't have to test the whole idea at once, but you can test components of it. Create rough drafts, so don't get hung up on details initially. And if you can, make modifications while you're talking with someone. Scale and sustain. So when a program's designed to be desirable or valuable as well as impactful, loyalty, engagement, retention are a lot less of an issue. So as I've said before, you want to leverage existing behavior or habits. You want to build on existing systems and utilize underused resources. So for Becoming One, as you'll learn from Jackie later on, this is a program that used faith leaders and churches who really built on all of these things for scale and sustainability. So I'll talk a little bit about what a blended approach looks like now that we've got sort of the design piece of it covered. So a blended approach is looking at near transfer, so evidence, users and context, and then also far transfer, so analogous experiences in behavioral science. It really requires an interdisciplinary team of core people, some of who are experts in their field or experts in the local context, and then some design folks. And this can take many permutations. And then you have a flexible team really to bring in specific, important knowledge at specific points. Great. So I will talk, do a little bit of an introduction to Becoming One. Christopher, a faith leader that we worked with in the pilot, this was in Gulu, Uganda last year, said it's like there was a scan to get what was most meaningful and needed for the generation. And I like this quote just because it really ties well back to the design process, which Christopher articulated much better than I just did. This is really what the process was, right? You scanned around to understand what was going to be meaningful for people, and that's what we built. So the project goal for us was to develop and test interventions that have a meaningful and sustainable reduction in IPV. I won't go too deeply into this, but you can tell that this was a project goal that, that we all aligned on at the beginning, and it was important to really articulate what these specific words meant for the whole team. So the program design consisted, this is what the program was in the end. So we did a little flat lay here. So at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a faith leader guide. And this was essentially what the faith leader used to lead their sessions. You can see wristbands around the faith leader guide. They said, I love my wife and I love my husband. And this was, again, something a faith leader was using in Liberia, where we were first doing field work. And we said, that's sort of an amazing prop to use. So we essentially stole those and built them into this program. Underneath the blue wristbands is a couples guide. And now these were beautifully illustrated by a local Ugandan company. And every couple got a guide. And I'll tell you a really short, wonderful story about these guides is some folks did not want to, in Gulu, women, traditionally, they sat on the floor and men sat in chairs. And we said, look, the men and the women, each couple gets one guide. And rather than say, women need to be seated in a chair because they're equal and it's just awkward to have a circle around a pastor where some people are on the floor and some people are in chairs, we said, it's really about sharing the guide, right? So you need to share the guide. So however you want to do it, just share the guide. So women all of a sudden began sitting next to their husband and they sat in chairs. And so it became essentially a tool that created sort of the physical behavior that we wanted to see, that was representative of the thinking we wanted to see also. In addition, there were bags that were branded for the faith leader. And there was also a tablet. And this tablet had training videos on it. And something that, I touched on earlier, which is how do people find out about the program? We created marketing tools. So learn the secrets to a successful relationship. You can see the poster in the corner and some of the cards down above the bag. This is the way we cast the program, because we realized no one wants to come to couples counseling, but people certainly want to learn the secrets to a successful relationship. So we thought about marketing and branding from the beginning as well. So we looked at a few different pathways to the prevention of intimate partner violence. We wanted to motivate men not to use violence, improve men and women's skills to communicate on difficult and potentially contentious topics, problem solve, and regulate emotions. And this was largely focused on how do we improve communication. We wanted to increase women's decision-making and control over finances, increase transparency around finances, change social norms and religious beliefs to support men's nonviolence and women's equality, and increase understanding of consensual sex and communication about sex with their partners. The research we're using, so this was something that was identified not immediately when we started the program, but once we began to understand a mixture of what faith leaders and couples wanted and saw as the problem, and what we knew research also supported. So faith leaders were asking for communication. They were asking for things about sex. They were asking for things about finances because they saw these as clear problems. So we were careful to not insert too much content that was not also seen as an issue by faith leaders. So I'll talk a little bit about how in the process, before Jackie goes deeply into sort of what we did and what we learned, I'll talk a little bit about the timeline for becoming one. So, you know, depending on what field you come from, this may look fast or slow. But we started off with framing. And when we were framing, we thought, what's the latest behavioral evidence in violence reduction? So the top line is really where research played this absolutely critical and catalytic role in our thinking. And then below that, in the yellow, you can really see what, you know, our version of a design process looked like. So this is a really great snapshot of the interplay between the two. And then finally, the bottom row is just the tangible examples of the different versions we came up with. So thinking about fieldwork and ethics was huge for us, because especially if you're testing these materials, you need to think about, and trying to do it quickly and in front of someone, you need to have a really strong ethical procedure to make sure that you're doing it safely. And then you have analysis. So we came up with a lot of ideas. There were a lot of opportunities, and research played an incredibly important role in helping us edit down our opportunities to be aligned with what evidence already existed. And this helped us drop opportunities, which was the most important. Then we created some prototypes. And then when we settled on an idea, we looked again at existing evidence or impactful programs to build our content on. So we want to use reliable content despite perhaps taking a new approach. Then at the same time, we were finding a partner, and we did prototyping across multiple countries to figure out if there was scalability across East African countries. We learned things like no one wants to read a long book of instructions. And so as you can see in one of the second to last image, we created, in a matter of a week, we created a little tablet program where instead of reading the instructions, you could watch a video that explains what you do. So we create video-based instruction. Then we took on more field research after that testing. And again, during our field research and our piloting, really, and Jackie can talk much more to this, we really worked with incredible technical researchers to understand things like desirability and task completion. So were people actually able to do this? So not just looking at impact, but what was the experience of people who were using this program? And in addition, during the pilot, we sought to build on the flaws and the failures and make them better. And then finally, we did a costing and scale analysis going forward. So after the pilot, trying to understand what the implications were of a lot of this. And then we did additional testing to see if we could bring down the cost and increase the scale, which we'll also talk more about. We did content revisions, and this was directly addressing things that were discovered during the pilot and through the research during the pilot. And then in addition, for the research planning before RCT, we assembled a PI team, agreed on design outcomes that were directly, impact outcomes and sub-outcomes that were directly related to the design. So having been so specific about what we thought our pathways were, what we thought was going to happen, and building that into design, it was actually really easy to figure out our outcomes and sub-outcomes. And then we've also, after the RCT, in response to what we learned during baseline, have also been developing additional content that is now violence response content in response to the large amount of violence we saw at baseline. So now we're going to go into talking a little bit about the pilot, and I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Before I proceed, I would like to invite everyone to drop some comments and questions in the chat box. On your screen, you'll see the chat box. So to talk a little bit about the pilot, during the pilot, we did recruit around 35 faith leaders who were selected to join the Becoming One program. And these were supposed to recruit about 17 couples to participate and together complete 12 sessions of Becoming One sessions in 8 weeks. Faith leaders were able to mobilize and teach and have counseling sessions with some with 25 couples and others with lesser couples, but on average, every faith leader was able to mobilize about 10 to 12 couples throughout the 12 sessions in 8 weeks. What research methods did we use for the pilot? And again, this was in the northern part of Uganda, that is in Gulu. And throughout the pilot, we used mainly qualitative methods of data collection that included semi-structured interviews with men and women. This was usually at the respondent's home, and we interviewed both men and women separately, like a male interviewer interviewing a male interviewer interviewing a male respondent, and a female interviewer interviewing a female respondent. This was mainly to give a platform for the same gender sharing, to give people the comfort of sharing and opening up to experiences. So we also had semi-structured interviews with faith leaders to learn more from the experience in conducting Becoming One and what they recommended, maybe for change, for to make Becoming One material and content much better. We also did post-session debriefs with couples immediately after the sessions. We would basically interview 2 couples out of the whole number that was attending to still understand how they perceive the whole program and the session. So besides the interviews, we had to sit in on observations to observe what the session looks like, to observe how the faith leader conducts the session, to conduct how the couples sit and behave throughout the questions, how they contribute. So this was also a great learning point. Besides the interviews, as the research team and the design team and the PI team, we had a weekly 3-hour synthesis session where we had to get main insights, get going forward. How can this be changed? How can this be made better? Do people like this? Don't people like this? And again, as Rachel mentioned earlier on, we kept our minds open to the fact that we are not who we are designing for. So it was so important that we look at people's opinions, understand how they treat the different materials and pieces of the program, because people are different. And literally, we are not very similar to the people that we are designing for. And a program that is designed for the people should be made as appropriate and convenient and user-friendly for the people to adapt. Those were the research methods that we used. And some of the pros with the research methodology was that we had specific and open feedback. Also because, like I mentioned before, that men were talking to men, women were talking to women, so we had open feedback. We really had intimate stories coming in from women, from men, which we probably wouldn't have got if there was a mix of gender in interviewer and respondent. So with this, we gave participants room for sharing, room for critiquing, room for just telling us, opening up. Another pro of the methodology were people brought up changes that we didn't even anticipate. You know, there's always something in the back of your mind, this will happen, this will happen. But through the interviews we got information that we didn't even anticipate would happen. Later, when I'm talking about the impact, I'll mention some of these unintended consequences. We had some observations, so everything wasn't self-reporting. So there are some lessons that we learned from observations, not because couples were telling us or faith leaders were telling us, but we were observing. And again, this was a great learning point for us to rechange and research the program for better user-friendly. So this means that even with a skepticism of self-reporting, a lot of insights were captured during the session observations. A little bit of the drawbacks included there are no observations or interviews of couples who didn't participate in becoming one. So we literally didn't have like a comparison to people who are not in becoming one. We only focused our attention to people who are in becoming one. So no comparison at all, with also the same couples to the life before becoming one. So even when we are seeing you exposed to becoming one, we really don't know the life you had before becoming one. So still, interviews were self-reported, and it's possible that some people can try to say what is pleasing in the eyes of the interviewers. Moving on, why people said becoming one worked for them, or what was really helpful about the material and the content, that it was very appreciated and adapted by the people, is one, we had desirable tools for people to use. We had, like Rachel mentioned, we had the couples guide, we had the faith leaders guide, we had wristbands, we had material that really good to the eye, beautiful material, beautiful colors, pictures, and this excited couples and the faith leaders to really use the materials and understand them, and even to the, like something as small as, you know, I feel proud of moving with my book. When I need to remember something, I open my guide. There are several testimonies there of people commenting about like how the tools were really beautiful to use. We have someone saying just by holding it, you feel changed. And we were able to learn from the kid during the session because it kept reminding us during our revision at home. So we had desirable tools to the users. We had images. One thing about the images was we were dealing with not so urban Uganda, but semi-rural, semi-urban, a little bit of a mix. And even when our users were not so well equipped with the language, reading and writing, they were not so very literate, they could use the pictures to understand what the story is about. Like, what is this trying to tell me? So the aspirational images were so good for the users to use, even the illiterate users found themselves understanding the materials. Again, we have several quotes from talking to the couples saying, I was inspired by the picture of the man saving together with his wife. They look so happy doing, and from that, we've decided to start saving together next year. So the pictorials throughout the materials were something that was really adapted by the users. We have one important reason that came up, the biblical foundation of the program. So Becoming One is, by the fact that it uses faith leaders to reach couples, every content in the guide is backed up by a Bible scripture. And we have a saying here, you should have heard of it, that if it is from the Bible, then it is true. So because of the program coming to the couples from their faith leaders, everything is engraved in biblical verses and scripture readings. The couples gained the confidence that this was trustworthy and it was worth their adapting to, and this is God telling me what to do. So couples do trust God's plan to have peaceful marriages, and the program was perceived as a vessel through which God's will for their marriages was being manifested. Again, we have quotes of couples and pastors saying, I am a committed Christian. This program is a good one because it is backed by biblical texts. So being based on biblical foundation really helped the couples to follow the lessons learned and to really get to understand what the content was about. We have another aspect of why it worked. This is both to the couples and the faith leaders and observations. These are things that these are learning points that came from all that methodology. So we had storytelling in class, which was in two ways. So we had storytelling that was personal from couples, from faith leaders, from participants, and through sharing, they would give testimonies about challenges they faced. They would give like practical solutions of how they had sorted the problems. And this allowed participants to feel that they were not alone in these challenges. And it gave them, even by the faith leaders sharing their personal stories, they got that connection with their couples, because usually it's easy to think of faith leaders as small gods. So hearing that they also have family challenges that have been sorted out, it is something that is comforting to the couples. And also knowing the fact that you're not the only one facing these particular challenges, and actually others are facing more bigger challenges than you are, is comforting in a way. And it helps for that communal coming together, like how it's done in the AA groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, something like that. So storytelling was really an important part of Becoming One. And then we had storytelling that was from the material itself, from the Faith Leaders Guide. So we had written stories that were very relatable. We had the stories using local names. If, for example, if I'm Jackie Namubiru, the story could maybe say Namubiru, or names that were relatable in the local context, stories that were relatable, talking of harvests, talking of school fees issues. So all these stories and solutions given in the stories were really a very good learning point for the couples. And whether the story was about emotional regulation or growth, or couples coming up with solutions for problems, they really did apply to our couples' lives. Okay, so the fail-safe design is, what if a woman came alone? So even when women came alone, they would go back home and change their reactions, for example, in the way they communicate, in the way they respond to their husbands. And this would in turn create a reaction from their partners who didn't even attend. So it didn't take two people to attend the session for them to be changed. Even single participation would lead to change. One of the activities in becoming one was teach a class. After teaching the class, let them go home and practice. We called it home practice. But what if no or little home practice was done? We still had couples applying lessons learned in class, lessons that were relevant to their situations, transferred and reflected in their usual lives. For example, favorite activities were reflected in the way people were talking to their spouses or reacting or calming down. So even when with no or little home practice being done, we were still seeing change that was coming in from the lessons learned in class. Okay, so what if a faith leader didn't prepare? Because faith leaders, being a faith leader is it's a wide responsibility. There are different responsibilities with the church, with the couples, with the community. So what if there's a session and a faith leader hadn't attended? Still, their skills as a faith leader allowed them to improvise successfully, and the guide was as clear enough for them to deliver the sessions, even at a glance. Also, to add on this, even with not preparing, the pictures in the couple's guide could be interpreted and could make up a whole section in the session. What if a faith leader was unskilled or misunderstood activities? And yes, we did have some faith leaders who were not so skilled, who were not so literate, but still this still had lessons to teach couples, especially from the pictorials. And like I mentioned before, the guide was clear enough for them to deliver the sessions at a glance. So they really did try to deliver the materials, even with the not so skilled and the not so literate ones. Are we still okay? The surprises. One of the biggest surprises we had was in the physical proximity and the intimacy of couples. The before and the after were really so different because, again, let me say this, that this has to do something with the culture that couples don't usually move together, especially in peri-urban places. Couples don't travel together. If they have to come to church, everyone comes independently. Usually the man comes first and the woman comes with the children. They don't sit together in church. Everyone will sit at the back, one will sit at the front. Then they don't have eye contact. I remember we had a story from, this was a testimony talking to a couple after, and she was married for 7 years to the husband, and she had never seen the husband straight in the eye. She had never had an eye contact with the husband, or she had never actually seen him naked. So every time they had to sleep together, they would either have to turn off the lights or, just sleep at night. So there wasn't that kind of intimacy. So after, what happened is there was reinforcing the idea of spending quality time together. Men and women first leaned away at the start, but then they had to share a book, like Rachel said before, and then they started getting used to sitting together and then leaning in, and then later they would both lean in public. Then we did attend some final ceremonies, and a final ceremony is the ceremony that came in after the 12 rounds of learnings, and there was too much affection going on. We had people embracing in public, people even kissing in public, and this is something that you don't see here at all. Here, I mean in Africa, in Uganda. So we really did see this in the sessions, especially at the end. There was a physical proximity and intimacy. Okay, so a couple's motivation and what the immediate rewards were. So we had partners seeing and feeling the immediate benefits of changing their own behaviors with home practice. Like I said, home practice is you learn in class, go try it out. And by trying it out, you realize that, you know what, I need to change something about how I communicate with my wife, how I talk to my wife, how I talk to my husband. And still with the same practice, there was positive reinforcement to try out more activities and more lessons learned in class. And changes in one's behavior usually received equal and maybe even much better change from the partners. So a change in one leading to a change in the other. And there's that positive reinforcement to keep on changing and changing because of the change in the partners. Also, men often choose to help their wives out with household tasks. The initial rationale for these changes was to work together equally, and equality in the Bible was also emphasized as the reason to initiate changes. Again, roles were blended. Men would help out with women's jobs and see the happiness that this would bring to their wives. We have some quotations there. A faith leader saying, feels like encouragement can also come in from appreciation. When my wife cooks and I appreciate her, it encourages her to cook even better next time. Okay. So I'm handing over to Rachel. Again, I'm reminding everyone to post comments or questions in the chat box right on the side. Thank you. Rachel.
Great. Sorry, go ahead, Priya.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Just a reminder again, we encourage you to use the chat box for your questions and comments. However, if you want to ask your questions out loud, please flag that in the comment section and you'll be able to do that. But if you can put it in the chat box, that would be great. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much. So I briefly mentioned that during the pilot, we also ran some additional experiments that were a response to what Jackie and the design team were finding in the field. So I'll talk through some of those. So one is we learned early on that churches often charge for couples counseling or premarital counseling. So we wanted to understand what the business model might be behind this, if this could add to the revenue generation of churches. So we wanted to understand things like people's personal investment. Were they willing to invest their own money into supporting Becoming One? So was it, we found that couples were willing to contribute food and pool resources for the final ceremony. We learned that faith leaders were willing to invest personally in this. And then in addition, we wanted to understand how people perceived of this program in terms of monetary value. So what different types of business models would this work with? Is this one in which people wanted to buy the, merchandise, for example? Would they pay for the classes? Did they want to pay for the couples guides? What did they perceive to be the thing that they wanted to pay for and then own? Then another thing we looked at was really developing recruiting and marketing tools for faith leaders. So what kind of adaptations do we need to make? Is this something where we want it to be a beautiful poster, or is this something that should be easily shareable? Do we want to give a little hint of what the content is on this? So faith leaders were initially worried about recruiting couples to participate. And so we responded to their concerns by really exploring how we could build better marketing for them.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Sorry, everyone. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Jackie. Fantastic presentation and lots of questions. One is Sophia. She wants to know, how did you identify this as a general problem or intervention in Uganda and then narrow it down to the specific areas you developed solutions for?
I have a really easy answer to that. We saw what people were already doing. So we basically took some cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based approaches. We actually started our research in Liberia. We took them to Liberia. We sat down with one gentleman named Pastor Patrick, who, we talked to men, we talked to women, we talked to community leaders, we talked to religious leaders. We showed some of our, sacrificial concepts, which I mentioned earlier, to Pastor Patrick. So I can actually show you what we showed him. So these blue ones, what is the goal, personal space, these are different like calming methods or communication methods. We showed them to Pastor Patrick and he said, he slowly picked them up and started putting them in his briefcase. We were at his house. It was late at night. He wanted to go inside. And I was like, would you like to take these? And he said, yeah, I'm going to use them in my premarital counseling class on Sunday. And that was essentially it. The light bulb went off. We said, Pastor Patrick knows exactly what to do with these different, therapy techniques. He's really interested in the evidence-based stuff that we've made examples of. And not only is he comfortable and confident sort of improvising with them in a group setting, he already has the group and they're also interested in learning from him. So it was a really good, I think it was fascinating for us to see and a really good, sort of aha moment. And then we went with him to his couples counseling class and we realized, yep, this is what we got to do. This is our audience. This is our messenger. And these are, again, existing sort of channels and habits that people are already invested in, and we should help support that and build on that.
Okay, so this is from Clara. She has 2-3 questions and I'm going to pop one now. She says, how did you identify the local values and religious principles from Bible that supported gender equitable relationships instead of focusing on those that legitimate male superiority? Did you work with faith leaders that were already open to these ideas and concerned about violence?
Could you repeat the first part of that question again?
She wants to know how the team identified the local values and religious principles from the Bible that supported gender equitable relationships instead of focusing on those that legitimate male superiority.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to just point people to this slide I have up right now where it's looking at needs and values. So, it was a little bit of a controversial approach where we said, we know this based on different pathways and based on the evidence, we know looking at financial transparency, emotional regulation, communication, and sexual consent is important from a behavioral standpoint to sort of figure out the prevention and the reduction of violence. Knowing that, we then had many, many open-ended conversations with faith leaders to say, what are some of the challenges in relationships in your community that you think lead to violence or that you help counsel people on? So it was looking at sort of the needs in the community, looking at how faith leaders perceived those needs and what they felt like they could bring. And then in addition, I have more like I'm Jewish and I have more Christian couples counseling books at my home than anyone has any business having. We looked at what the sort of market was already offering up. What do couples counseling books look like? What topics do they touch on? And then we sort of looking at those 3 things really, focused in on the topics that Jackie talked about. And, a lot of it was it was a little bit of a finagling of like, how do you look at communication, but really focus on emotional regulation and transparency and focusing the very practical skills that we were trying to deliver to actually address people's problems. So as I mentioned before, just in the design process, it was a continual going back to our users and to faith leaders to make sure that what we were addressing was an actual need, and then how we were sort of framing it and the tools we were providing were actually solving the problem.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. The next question is from Kiri. She says, might have missed this, but can you remind us about the number and frequency of sessions? She wants to know if there were one-to-one sessions or in groups.
Jackie, you want to take this?
Yeah, we had 12 sessions in total, and it was a group session. It was a group counseling session with one faith leader and the number of couples they had in class. Initially, about the pilot, they had to do becoming one twice every week, but later, because of what we learned from this, later we transitioned it into one session per week.
Okay. Next question is from Anna. She says the slide which showed the project team was shown very quickly. It did seem like a large project team with a lot of expertise would be needed. How can very small organizations with limited resources adapt this methodology for use?
Yeah, great question. So one of the challenges with design is that this is a pretty long process. It's not actually I mean, my feedback from some of my colleagues who are not designers is that this actually goes faster than a lot of program development processes. But yes, it's a labor-intensive process, and the team is relatively large. The way that you can slice this is what we've done here, which is to have a core team, which can be smaller than this, certainly. And then to have a flex team, as we call it, which is people you bring in at tactical moments. So, for example, when we're developing content, it was extremely important for us to have religious experts, violence experts, couples counseling experts, and then to have, again, these sort of academics and PIs and different technical advisors that we would bring in at specific moments. And then on the core team, it was also, people were focused on it. Probably I might have been the only one that was 100% of my time across this and another project. So not even 100% of my time. But it really is a matter of, I think, someone driving the process and understanding the most cost-efficient way to bring other skill sets in. But the other piece that I want to say is, this is really, it's a luxury to do this process. It's a lot of money and a lot of time. And there are small pieces, if you look at the different mindsets and approach we talked about, there are small pieces of this that you can apply to any process. And designers are also great contractors and consultants. So even, following this process yourself, bringing in a designer at specific moments can make huge improvements, right? It doesn't have to be this whole process. I think a lot of consultancies you talk to are not going to give you examples of how to slice their expertise so you pay a lot less, but it's totally doable. And so I would, highly recommend people look at parts of this process or little practical things that they can do themselves, or that they can maybe bring someone in to help with for a few weeks, and not be scared by what looks like this sort of monster of investment you have to make at the very beginning.
The next question is from Erin. She says, thanks so much for such a fascinating presentation. I wasn't clear about the financial transparency on behalf of men with their female spouses. Did this mean they had more control over women's earnings, or was it more related to equal decision-making among couples around finances?
I can take this one. Jackie, correct me if you remember something slightly different. It was really a concern that our research team had. It was not a concern that women or men had. So one of the issues was in the biblical principles, it was like transparency, men and women should share with each other and discuss what to do with the money and save together and have mutual goals. One of the things we knew was happening is that women were putting money aside for emergencies. They had their own sort of stockpile of money. And what we were essentially telling them, what the faith leaders were telling them, is you should share all that. That was our concern. Once we learned that women were indeed, they absolutely appreciated the transparency, they wanted the transparency, and they felt like they had to reciprocate. What we also learned is that if women didn't feel safe, they absolutely weren't going to share the money and show the money. So it wasn't really an issue, but just to give you a sense of the, some of the things that were a little surprising to us, the level of risk tolerance we had, the ethical considerations that we were thinking about throughout this, it was something that we wanted to really double click on and go deeper into as we were learning, because it was a real risk, but it turns out that for all the women we spoke to, they were confident in handling it themselves.
Yeah, the next question, a small question from Azizi asking, do you guys have plans for a full RCT in future?
Yep, we just finished up our midline. Jackie, do you want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, after the pilot, we had a few months to prepare materials according to the pilot feedback, and we started the midline. We started an RCT this year. We started an RCT last year actually, and we've had both the baseline and the midline. Yeah, it's still pushing on until sometime next year. Yeah.
Very interesting question from Kiki. This sounds like a great intervention and many of the reported outcomes seem transformative. On a few occasions, I noticed some comments that describe women effectively censoring or changing their behavior in order to avoid violence. For example, when the man comes home drunk, the woman waits for him to sober up. This is something I've come across a lot in prevention of violence against women projects I have worked on, and always worry whether the reduction in violence will be sustained until there is genuine change in gender relations. I'm wondering what your thoughts on this are.
So I think there are two things. One is we absolutely saw similar behavior from men in terms of being able to avoid violence and emotionally regulate. One of the things, the example of women sort of not having a hard conversation when a man comes home drunk is we have them do like an if-then, a bunch of if-then statements. So we have them identify triggers to violence and then make a plan for if that trigger arises. And we have both men and women do this. It was absolutely something where we wanted to make sure that women were not censoring themselves. And so we had a lot in communication that was about how to have a hard conversation. But this was something also that was really important to faith leaders, which is we need to be practical and strategic about giving women tools to avoid violence. And so we wanted to look at those critical moments when we knew a lot of violence happened. And rather than sort of take this very long road of, can we get men to stop drinking, or can we get drunk men to respond differently to women? It seemed like the most direct path to reducing violence was to give women tools to have the conversation the next morning. So we really didn't think of it as them not being able to talk about it, but rather knowing when the right moment to have that hard conversation was. But it was something we certainly talked about, and we wanted to approach it the right way. And we also wanted to make sure that women were comfortable with it and that faith leaders were comfortable with it. And that men were also doing similar emotional regulation work.
Yeah, from Lindsay, she asked, how would you go about adapting this program to a new context? What elements of the design process would you repeat? Would you try out the same materials or start from scratch?
Oh, definitely want to start from scratch. What we've done so our pilot was in Gulu, our RCT is in Western Uganda. We didn't quite realize how different the population was, but we've kept a close track of what modifications we've needed to make in order to make it contextually relevant. So some of the illustrations, as Jackie mentioned, all the names change. A lot of translation needed to be done. You know, as you adapt for different contexts, the more you adapt, the more expensive it becomes. So we've tried to keep, you know, the minimum adaptations necessary. One thing we did early on is look across East Africa to say, is the religious context even relevant? And we realized in places like Ethiopia, it's absolutely not, right? The religious setup is very, very different. These premarital classes don't happen. So we're definitely looking to scaling. We're actually doing a scaling project right now in Kenya to understand if we can go and scale directly through churches. So it's a very, very much an ongoing process, one in which we're trying to understand what the most superficial changes we can make are. So for example, if we were to do this in an urban context, likely it would not need to be as designed for semi-literate or illiterate users, and rather than using illustrations, we'd use photographs. So we're actually taking we would like to not make that many changes. So we're trying to understand how we can reach the most people with the fewest amount of changes.
Clara asks, how were the pastors trained or made familiar with the content or the prototype they had to use? And how was this done and how long did this take?
Jackie, you are the expert on this. Please take it.
We had a training of pastors. I wouldn't call it training because it was more of these are the materials, this is the program, do the program. And this was an important learning experience for us because every faith leader has a different understanding, a different adaptability to the materials. And it was the main source of us understanding the user-friendly part of the program. So in the pilot in Gulu, we really didn't, I wouldn't call it training, maybe give highlights of the content of the program as a whole and the to-dos and not to-dos of the program. Yeah, so we would say a learning point for us was the 12 rounds that they were having the sessions and the different adaptabilities, and that was learnings for us to change the materials for future years. Thank you.
Yeah. Sophia is asking, how involved was the design team in program implementation? What was your process of having the program teams own the design and successfully / accurately implement the program?
I mean, we were a very, very collaborative, flat team. So there, you know, while we sort of envisioned, we did all these like matrices where it was like, this is your responsibility and this is ours. Like Jackie is part of the research team, but she also does faith leader training because she's amazing at it. And that's what sort of has come up. So it's really at every stage, as much as possible, World Vision, who was our implementing partner for our pilot and our RCT, the research team and the designers have sort of worked together on everything and all contributed to the ideas and the development of it. And then at the same time, I think we also recognize places in which we have much less expertise and we try to let people do their own work. So World Vision was very, very bought into this because 6 months after the project started, after, you know, we met Pastor Patrick and we realized, oh, this is a faith leader thing and the IRC knows nothing about faith leaders. We went to World Vision and one of their regional directors said, oh, we have this program. It doesn't have a lot of prevention work in it. And we really developed it together with them. So this was something where I think because people had a lot of buy-in from the beginning, it was, there was a lot of understanding and a lot of sort of mutual support and contribution to the implementation.
Yeah, our last question for the day. Katie has two questions. I'm answering the second one. Yes, we will be sharing the presentation and you can find it on our website. to go through later. Her question to the panelists is, thanks for the presentation. I really enjoyed how it moved from the design process to hearing some very specific examples of how this worked in Uganda. Do Jackie or Rachel have any observations about what the most surprising things to emerge from the design process were? That is, what was included in programming because of going through this rapid prototyping process that would likely not have been included if you had gone through a standard approach to program design.
Jackie, you want to go first? I need to.
I'll answer probably half of the question. To me, one thing that was really surprising, and at some point we kind of made it a theme for all of us, is we had different expectations. I mean, different, as a person, I had this in mind, you know, this is an IPV program, this should look like this should look like this, but again, Rachel was so good at emphasizing this. We are not who we are designing the program for, so don't look at what you think should happen or what the impact should be or how the faith leader should do this. Don't think of the materials on your side. Just look at everything from the participants' side. So that was a great learning point for me. It was a change for me because incorporating and blending research and design was a process for me. It was a new process for me, and it was a good learning process to that. Thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie and I are frequently in like a mutual admiration club. So I would say pretty similar things, which is it's been amazing to be able to understand how flexible people can be and open and amazing the work is that can come out of groups of people who you're told have a specific expertise. So for example, IPA, right? They're researchers, they do research for economists, most of it's quantitative. And to be able to work with Jackie and her team and really have amazing qualitative research that's so far beyond what's ever come out of any design consultancy I've worked with. And to be able to have them learn prototype testing sort of immediately and do, learn about not just, is this working and what's happening, but really have the best ideas about what to do about it. So it really was an opportunity for, I think, all of us and a learning experience for me about what amazing collaboration can look like with people across discipline. So, it is about what the sort of title of this presentation is. It's the integration of these different skill sets and how successful that reliance and collaboration can be was, something I think we all hoped for at the very beginning, but was such a amazing and, in the end, in a lot of different small and big ways was surprising for me.
Thanks, Rachel and Jackie, for a wonderful presentation and for such lively discussion. Thanks to everyone who participated for sending in their questions, comments, and it made it very engaging. Please follow us on Twitter. The Twitter handle is at prevent_collab. We'll be retweeting any more questions that you have and encourage conversations around them. Signing off with an introduction, I am Priya Pillai. I'm a Senior Knowledge Associate with the with the Prevention Collaborative. Thanks, everyone. And the webinar is going to be available on our website. Please visit our website to access it anytime you want. Thank you so much.